The thing about ships is that they move with the ocean. If there is a major storm, the ship will also move accordingly. And so some of the ways that ships can move in heavy seas is they can pitch backwards and forward sharply, or they can roll. But people have wondered, what is it like to sail aboard one of these old-fashioned ocean liners in heavy seas? What would it have been like? Because we have video footage of what it's like for cruise ships, and even the Queen Mary II ocean liner. They've seen what it's like to be on rough seas, and those are very stable ships most of the time, with some exceptions. But what was it like to stay on one of these old ships during heavy seas? Well, what I'm about to say is more of a generalization, so keep in mind that it differs from ship to ship. Some ships were more steady in rough weather, while some other ships were less steady in rough weather. But essentially, if the ship was rolling enough, the usual activities that were happening on the ship, such as people going for a walk around the promenades, or people having dinner in the cafes or restaurants, or having a drink at some of the cocktail lounges, depending on what year that was, essentially those activities would come to a halt. A lot of times what ocean lines did was, when the ship was hitting some really heavy weather and the ship was pitching and rolling violently, the passengers would be asked to stay in their guest rooms. Now, what's interesting is, with most of these old-fashioned liners, people usually attended things like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They were basically the events of the day, because back then there really wasn't much to entertain people besides games and socializing. So having a really long meal at the end of the day, one that lasts a couple hours with several courses, was a way to pass the time. But as you can imagine, if the ship is rolling heavy enough or pitching heavy enough that you can't go to the dining room, you would have to be locked in your room, essentially. And what would happen is, the poor stewards and stewardesses would have to bring you a very basic meal and bring it straight to your stateroom so you could eat it there. And so, as you can imagine, it was very boring. You'd have to sit there eating food. There was a story of a time when the Queen Mary hit some really heavy seas, and former steward / waiter Ralph Rushton, he was delivering sandwiches to the passengers' staterooms. So as you can imagine, they were ready to have this great big beautiful fine dining meal, but they were forced into eating sandwiches for dinner. And that's because it's difficult. As you can imagine, if they tried to deliver you a hot bisque or something, it would spill all over the place. So as you can imagine, it was not fun back then to be on a ship in rough weather. Today, if you're on a cruise ship or the Queen Mary II in rough weather, for the most part, you can still enjoy a good time. You can still, have a drink, have some coffee or tea or something, and just watch the waves hit the ship. But back then, it was really a damper on the day. You couldn't do anything but stay in your room the entire time. And sometimes you'd be in the middle of a storm for more than half the voyage. So it really was not a pleasant thing. But let's say the weather wasn't that bad. Let's say the ship was still pitching and rolling. Well, what could you do if you didn't have to stay in your room? Well, essentially, with a lot of ships, they had handrails built into their hallways and things like that. But they would also tie ropes through the large rooms, the various lounges and things with the massive open areas. They would tie ropes through them so that way the passengers could hold on to the ropes as they walked through the room. And you might think, well, why in the world, if it's that bad and people can't stand up on their own, they need to hold on to railing, why would they let the passengers walk around? Well, again, it goes back to the fact that staying in your room all day was extremely boring, and it was also socially isolating. Well, you have to remember that these ships were not cruise ships. They were ocean liners. They weren't designed to be a destination in and of themselves. They weren't designed to entertain you constantly. They were just designed to keep you happy and content enough that you enjoyed your experience crossing the ocean. Now, you might know some ocean liners had swimming pools. Well, those swimming pools could easily be drained. We're used to backyard swimming pools today being one of those things where draining them is a big deal. You'd have to bring out a pump, you'd have to figure out where the water's gonna go because it's a lot of water. But the swimming pools on ocean liners, they have storage tanks that are below the swimming pool, whether it's right below the swimming pool or whether it's in a completely different room. But nevertheless, a lot of the swimming pools could be drained. On the Queen Mary, for instance, they could easily drain the pool in about 3 minutes. The reason why they would drain the pools is because, as you can imagine, if the ship is pitching or if it's rolling, the water in the pool would splash about. And that splashing, that movement of the water can actually make the pitching and rolling worse. So, as you can imagine, people couldn't use the pools. Not that you would want to anyway, because with the water splashing around, you'd probably be knocked into walls and such. But yes, being on a ship during really rough weather was not a fun thing like it might be today. So that is just a little bit of insight into what it was like to be a passenger during rough seas. I know it isn't much, but a lot of people have wondered, and that's honestly all I have for you in terms of that answer. It would have been incredibly boring, also scary, and most people would have been very ill. Anyway, thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this content, consider supporting my channel by either signing up for my Patreon or to my YouTube memberships. That way you can get exclusive perks in return. Links are in the description below. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.